I had no idea who these people were. I had no idea if they were a starving artist or a Wall Street banker. Like, really, when you strip everything away, you just are. And for me, on a very personal level, it became this very beautiful thing of connecting with people without any preconceptions or notions, other than obviously my own inner dialogue about body types and that sort of thing. Besides that, I didn't really have any other way to evaluate them, because I didn't know anything about them. All I saw was this person before me who was, trying to make a sincere effort to do this quote unquote practice.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I am excited about today's episode because it's a topic I've always wanted to learn more about. Today, we're talking about naked yoga. And I just want you to set aside whatever you think naked yoga is about, because you're going to learn so much if you listen to this week's episodes with me. We are interviewing Yogi Aaron. He is the author of an autobiography of a naked yogi, and he's the co-owner of Blue Osa Yoga Retreat and Spa in Costa Rica. He's going to tell us about the retreat center and also about his incredible personal journey as he developed Nude Yoga in New York in the early 2000s. Before we dive into the episode, I just want to remind you to support the show, leave a rating or review here on iTunes. Even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show, this really helps get the show in front of more people looking to transform their life through yoga and meditation. Your review really does make a difference. The other way you can support the podcast is by making a purchase at SivanaSpirit.com. This week, I'm featuring their gorgeous Himalayan salt lamps. They're not only a gorgeous glowing home decor feature, but they also emit beneficial healing ions into the air that protect you from EMFs. You can search salt lamps on SivanaSpirit.com to learn more. And remember, you can use that discount code podcast30 for 30% off anything your heart desires at SivanaSpirit.com. All right, so today we're going to learn about the world of nude yoga, a practice that is much deeper than you may think. We're going to learn from Aaron's fascinating personal journey as he developed and grew this practice from a small experimental class. He's going to tell us about that very first class to a large nude yoga studio offering 15 plus classes a week. Whether you think you might ever want to take your clothes off in yoga or not, this podcast is full of gems that's going to help you break through any blocks or preconceived notions about yourself. We talk about stripping away clothing as a way to access the deepest layers of ourselves. We discuss the potency of emotional release in yoga and in being comfortable and naked in our own bodies. There is so many gems in this week's episodes. So let's dive in and get started. I can't wait to share this conversation with Aaron. Aaron, thank you so much for being with us and coming on the show, all the way from Costa Rica.
All the way from beautiful, sunny paradise of Costa Rica on the beach, recording live.
I'm so glad to have you. And I know you didn't always live in Costa Rica. You used to be in New York, correct?
Yes, I lived in New York for 10 years.
And I'm so excited to have you on the show because, as I think I mentioned before I hit the record button, I have always been fascinated by this idea of practicing yoga with no clothes. Now, I'm going to be very upfront. I'm going to tell you this is not something I've tried, but I'm so curious about it. And I think it's something that people have misconceptions about, right? They don't really get it or know what it's about. Maybe they think it's something sexual. And as I told you, I had a student come into one of my classes a couple years ago, and we started chatting after class, and he let me know he was a yoga instructor and he was from the United Kingdom. And I asked him, oh, what kind of yoga do you teach? And of course, I was expecting him to say, Ashtanga or Iyengar, so, something like that. And he goes, I teach naked yoga. And I was a little taken aback, and I was like, oh, what's that like? I don't know anything about that. And of course, I had all my preconceived notions about what it was about. And he started telling me about it, and my mind was blown just about how it was so much deeper, and how he said, he was telling me practicing with no clothes, like you're able to get into asanas that you can't get into. It just really blew my mind. And ever since that conversation, I was like, I'm desperate to talk to someone who knows more about this. And I know you were a leader in kind of developing this style of yoga. So can you tell us about all of that? Like how you came to start doing it in the first place, or invent it, or I don't know what the right term is.
So there's no foreplay here. We're just jumping right in.
We're jumping right in.
Right?
I love it.
So, I mean, a little tongue-in-cheek aside, when I was, so my background is in Ashtanga, power yoga. One of my first teachers was Brian Kest. And so when I used to teach, as you can imagine, it was a co-ed class. And we used to get, of course, very sweaty. And so oftentimes we used to joke like, oh, we should, take off our clothes. And I think in a kind of a weird way, that was where, there was kind of two places where the idea started to percolate. But that was when I started thinking, wow, like what would it be like to do that? And how would that change the dynamic of this practice?
So that was stemming very much from just a place physically where could we get into the asanas better, or could we be more comfortable without clothes because you were really hot and sweaty?
Yeah. And for me, honestly, yoga has always been a practice of authenticity, of being real, of getting down and stripping away layers. I mean, even when I first started and didn't know anything, although I thought I knew everything. And it was always a thing. For me, it was always a way to, like, who is Aaron? So when I moved to New York, and I was finding my way, and I really, really wanted to teach gay men. And I sort of landed in Chelsea in New York, which in 2000 was sort of gay mecca of New York, that in the Village. And I was asking the question, like, if I really want to teach gay men, then what is a way to reach out to them? And for gay men, I would say that nudity is less of an issue than for other people. And that's just a broad generalization. I realize that. But so the idea came to me like, okay, well, what about naked yoga? Because there's so many, great gyms in the area, and a lot of them are offering like kind of hip yoga classes. What's something that no one else is doing? And I thought it would sort of be kind of like a little bit of a gag, not a gag, but a gimmick, if you will. And it would also satisfy my own curiosity, because I'm a kind of a person, I like to try everything at least twice. and sort of going back to that initial idea, it was like, what would it be like to do this practice naked? It would, kind of satisfy that curiosity. And it would be fulfilling, as sort of a dream of teaching gay men. And
it seemed like a way to outreach to the population that you really wanted to serve.
Yes. And so that was actually when I came up with the idea. I remember the exact moment. I was crossing 6th Avenue on the corner of 23rd Street and Avenue of the Americas. And I was literally, I walked halfway across the street because I had already been thinking about it. Then the idea came to my head. It's like hot nude yoga. And as one documentary person put it, it's everything it says, but nothing like it sounds.
So at this point, this was a totally new concept, right? Pretty much.
Totally new concept. I mean, to be fair, I had found out either just before my first class or after my first class that there was another naked yoga group in New York. It was called Midnight Yoga for Men. And it was this gentleman who was from the Shivananda lineage. Mm-hmm. And he used to hold his classes at 10:30. I think it was once or twice a week. And they would be those specific nights at 10:30, he would set up candles. And he was from what I heard, he was very strict in that practice. And so he had very focused practice. Whereby with me, what I was starting to think about was, okay, well, how can this practice be different? How can this practice, so if nakedness is something that gets people in the door and is something that is attracting people, what are we going to do that's going to be something more? And the answer that came to me, the broad answer came to me was Tantra. Within that scope of Tantra, what really emerged was community and this idea of creating Sangha. And so what kind of started to, I'm going to back up a second. So after the first class, I realized I think this is going to last longer than I thought, because I was only thinking, I'd do this for a couple of months and then move on.
And I want to back you up even further, if you don't mind. So you were already teaching clothed yoga at this time, right? You were already a teacher. Okay. And so you were just looking for a way to, really connect with the people you wanted to connect with and, find a good marketing hook or, edge to your classes, which makes total sense. Now, I want to ask you, because, as a teacher myself, I love developing sequences and experimenting with things. So did you just show up and was like, we're just going to practice naked? Or did you get naked yourself in your house and start seeing what the practice felt without clothes on first, kind of doing some investigative work personally? How did you do, how did the first class develop? Or was it really just we're all, you know what I'm saying? How did this happen?
So first of all, one of my favorite quotes is, if you don't know how to swim, just jump into the deep end of the pool. And if you're uncomfortable, the ladder is always there. So I just jump into the deep end of the pool. So part of the way that I started to create community, and I kind of did it consciously and unconsciously, and intuitively is probably a better word, is that I started doing partner yoga. And so I would the class was 2 hours. So it was from 7:30 to 9:30. And we would do the first half of the class closed. The first half of the class was a vinyasa sequence. And then the second half of the class was partner yoga. And so what I did to start to prepare was actually I had met a dancer, and he was taking my yoga classes at one of the dance centers that I was teaching, and we became friends. And I asked him one day, I said, do you mind starting to practice some of this, some of these partner yoga postures together to help me prepare for my class? I have to tell you something. We were very lucky. We actually went to one of the gyms that I was teaching at, and when the gym wasn't being used for yoga classes or what have you, we started doing this. It was the doorway opening to one of the most powerful experiences I have ever had in my life until that point in yoga. Because what started to emerge, and remember, we were clothed, we weren't naked, but we were doing these different postures. And what started to emerge is we got really deep into them. We were breathing together. Our breathing started synchronizing, started connecting at a very deep, this will probably make some of your listeners' eyeballs pop out, but at a very deep sensual level. It was not sexual. And I think a lot of people misinterpret those two meanings, because we are very sensual and sexual beings, but the two things are very different. And sensuality starts to open up our senses to experiencing something much more, if we allow it to, something much more than just what is, in front of us at that moment. And I remember people start talking about going deep into their practice. What does that really mean? I started going deep within myself, in a way that I had never gone before.
And Aaron, I'm guessing that you said this was around 2000s, right? So was acro yoga and partner yoga even really a thing yet? Or were you guys kind of early experimenters of that as well?
Dios mío. So no, this was one of the very first books ever written. I don't even think it's in print anymore. It was written by a guy named Kane Carroll. I don't remember his friend's name. It was two people that wrote this book, and I believe that the title of it was Partner Yoga. It was one of the only books ever written at that moment. And then a couple of years later, there was a flood of other books. It was one of the best books I've ever seen on partner yoga, though. The stuff that they have in there was so great.
So you guys were just working off this book, clothed, but having some really deep experiences together as your breath harmonized and you went deeper into the partner work.
Yeah, and what I started to realize is that this was a powerful way to connect. And you hear this a lot now when people are promoting partner yoga. There's this, the acro yoga group, and all about community. It's all about like, being together and breathing together. The way that we were doing it, though, was like really taking our time, really just allowing ourselves to melt into certain postures. Some of the postures were very intimate, and then some of them were, not so intimate. But what I started to feel was this kinetic force, that was between us, and it's starting to harmonize. And unless you've experienced that, it's really hard to explain it because it sounds so freaking woo-woo. But for me, this was the door opening for the possibilities of what, the tantrikas were trying to teach us.
So how does this partner work you're doing with him then evolve into the jumping off the deep end of hosting your first naked yoga class?
So just to be clear, I was so lucky. I mean, the goddess is always guiding us in some way or opening up doorways. So the doorway that opened up for me was I found this studio space. It was like on 28th Street and 5th Avenue, somewhere between 5th and Broadway. And this studio space was completely quiet at night. So by daytime in the week, it was an actor's studio. And then in the weekends, there was like nobody there, but they rented it out. So for a very small fee, I managed to secure the space. And the only way to get up there was through a locked elevator. So I had to unlock the elevator. People had to come up. So it was a very private space. I had a friend check in people, on the street level, and then they would just take the elevator up. And so what we did was we had people come into the room naked. So they were already naked when they came in the room. And so they left their clothes outside. And I remember my very first class, I was so petrified and so nervous. I laid down in Shavasana for like 20 minutes before the class started. And intuitively, I just knew, it was time to start. And so I sat up, turned around, and I saw 18 naked bodies before me, and I said, "Namaste, welcome," and then started to teach. I was so petrified. I can't even tell you.
I can only imagine because, I mean, I similar to you, I have teacher trainings and, everyone's always so afraid to teach and use their voice. And then it's like, okay, now do that naked. I mean, it sounds like something from a dream or something that you'd wake up panic.
Well, isn't that most people's nightmare to wake up from something and then
they're naked, yes.
You're naked in front of a group of people. That literally happened to me.
So people weren't taking their clothes off in the elevator, though. There was like a space before they came in the room where they'd take off their clothes. Because I think this is interesting. It's like the ritual behind something like this too. So you come into the room naked. They brought their own mat, or there were, mats there. So it's just you and the mat. Would people have towels and things that they brought to wipe their hands, or?
They had to bring everything. I mean, there was a list. I actually had a list of instructions for people to do before they came. Make sure that you shower. Any beans, 2 hours beforehand. Don't eat anything 2 hours beforehand. Make sure that you bring water, these sort of things. The other thing too is like if people didn't make it, like there was a 5-minute window so if the class started at 7:30, they had to be there at 7:25 or the door was locked, could not get up at all. So that was a great tapas because I always go to a lot of yoga classes where people walk in late. Here, it was like people couldn't get in unless they showed up on time. And that, I think, really started to engender kind of a seriousness about this.
Tell me about the atmosphere, because I think when I visualize naked yoga in my head, not knowing anything about it, I just thought of like sweaty bodies and lots of nudity and lights and sweat. And when I talked to this other person who came to my class who taught naked yoga, he was saying that he keeps the lights very, very dim. So it's almost dark, which I found fascinating. So is that sort of the ambiance you were creating as well?
For me, as a person, ambiance is very important. The very first space that we went into, the lighting was kind of like all or nothing. So I think that there was maybe a couple of lights that we could have on that were very low. We were, New York was our skyline. So a lot of like the light from the city came into the space. And it did definitely create a mood atmosphere. As I moved along in sort of this path, we started doing daytime classes. So obviously the mood lighting changed and became, something different. In the beginning, yeah, I think mood lighting was important, but it's also important. I mean, it's kind of like, you're doing naked yoga. Of course, you're going to you think that people are looking around, but actually it kind of got people, what I noticed, and I'm not sure, what I noticed is that it made people focus a lot more deeply. People were able to go much more deeply inward than they normally would have.
I know, and I'd love for you to talk to us now more about the differences between, a traditional yoga class that we're all familiar with and one in which the clothes are off. Because some things I remember this friend of mine saying was just that it does, like it brings you, your senses are heightened in a way. You're more in your body in some kind of way because you don't have any clothes on. And that you'd think it would be this thing, where like you're checking everyone out, but it actually isn't like that at all. It almost becomes, as you said, like the concentration is amplified, like just all these things that you wouldn't think would be the effect. Can you talk us through, like, what are the differences that you saw when people were practicing with and without clothes on?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So, I mean, I'm talking from the point of view of someone who's gay, who was teaching basically gay men. I mean, we did have some straight men come, bisexual men that came, but I never really taught co-ed classes. I think I only ever taught one in my life, I think, maybe two, but I never really taught co-ed classes. So I want to be right up front about that. And I think that there's a huge difference in teaching just men. I think that there's a sense of tribalism that comes out. Men have very different energy in yoga classes than women do. So there's that dynamic. So I just want to be clear, like I'm speaking from this point of view. The second thing, and this is kind of an interesting discussion because you do hear a lot of people make statements, oh, well, naked yoga is better because of blah, blah, blah. I would say that what made the classes special was the deep commitment to bringing community into the classes. And community can show up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we would huddle together and do some chanting. I love to chant. Oh my God. Chanting with 40 naked men is a beyond experience. So that's one way to create community. Another way is do partner yoga. So that's why I brought the whole partnering aspect into it. Another way is like, say, for example, you're doing a class where you're doing a lot of alignment stuff and you're getting people to kind of adjust each other. And when you're naked and you're doing like alignment stuff, it's very interesting because you can really get into some detailed stuff. So there was always a sense, and it was one of the things in my Hot Nude Yoga studio, while I didn't really have a format set for teachers, but doing something that was bringing community into the class was really important. And I had, close to the end when I was not at my studio all the time, I was busy traveling. I actually went and took one of my teacher's classes, or one of the teachers that was teaching at the studio, and I didn't know him. He was brought in by one of the other teachers. And it was interesting taking his class because he did not do anything that was partner related, that was like huddling together, or that was, connecting people. So what I noticed was that this class it was just a regular yoga class. There was nothing special about it. There was nothing to draw my attention to. It was nice to be in this group of people that were sort of like-minded, that were on the same path, that were doing yoga together, that were, feeling the sense of freedom. That was all great. But what I noticed over time that was made it extra special or extra dynamic or extra that really helped to guide the practice in a bigger direction was this aspect of bringing community into the class.
I think there's something also potentially very healing about, and I mean, I don't know if you had this sense, but I just imagine for me, doing something like this, you'd have to be really comfortable in your own skin, right? I mean, so many of us are, think of ourselves as advanced yoga practitioners, whatever that means, right? And we can do all these fancy poses, but, ask me to strip all my clothes off and just practice, even alone in my home naked. And that might feel uncomfortable for, I think, a lot of people. Do you think, so many of us just have shame around nudity and shame around our physical bodies. Can you speak to any experience you have with that at all?
So feel free to redirect me, because you just said a loaded statement and there's a lot of things to cover. One, I do think that a lot of people call themselves on a yogic path, and very few of us are really ready to tread into the darkness of our souls. And that's what I really try to bring out in my classes. That's what I try to bring out as a teacher in different ways. Obviously, as I'm not teaching naked yoga, I do it in different ways. But I do think that a lot of us, there's a very fine line. Our yoga practice serving us in a way that helps us strip away, that we hold on to, that cloak us in this kind of ego, this idea of who we think we are. And I think that from what I've seen, a lot of people came to Hot Nude Yoga not because they were comfortable in their skin, but because they were uncomfortable and they wanted to get comfortable. That was the most interesting thing. I would sincerely say 50 to 70% of the people that came to Hot Nude Yoga were people that were not comfortable in their skin. And what happened was, because the environment we provided was pretty neutral, and we didn't really, we had all kinds of people of all ages, of all body types. We had, people from, 20 years old all the way up to 70 years old. We had people of all ethnicities come to the classes. And what I quickly realized within like a year of doing this was I had no idea who these people were. I had no idea if they were a starving artist or a Wall Street banker. Like, really, when you strip everything away, you just are. And for me, on a very personal level, it became this very beautiful thing of connecting with people without any preconceptions or notions, other than obviously my own, inner dialogue about body types and that sort of thing. Besides that, I didn't really have any other way to evaluate them, because I didn't know anything about them. All I saw was this person before me who was, trying to make a sincere effort to do this quote unquote practice.
It's so interesting what you're saying, because it's like anything we put on our skin or our bodies is in some way defining our identity, right? Like the type of shirt I wear, or someone's wearing a bandana in their hair or not. It's like all these little things serve to build. You don't realize like how much all those little things are like informing your identity about yourself, like your choice of why you wear all these different things and the messages they're sending out. And it's like, especially if everyone left their clothing at the door before they even came into the class, like I really get what you're saying. It's like you had no idea who these people were, like from what walks of life or anything like that. It was just everything being stripped away like that. Yeah.
And what really came out of it was this amazing community that spread around the world in an amazing way. People found out about what I was doing. I actually made a series of DVDs, and one of the reasons for that was hoping that people would start their own sort of naked yoga group in their living rooms and invite friends over and, just to share a practice. And then what ended up happening was a lot of people actually started their own sort of quote unquote naked yoga studios or naked yoga group in their own city. And this community of people that, at least what I was seeing in New York and on my yoga retreats, was a group of people that were really committed to a path that was set on unveiling the authentic self and really supporting and cherishing that as it started to emerge within each other. And nothing spoke more clearly than when we started doing our Memorial Weekend retreats, and we would have anywhere from 46 men to the largest one I ever had was 80 men come, and it was like weekend gay naked yoga camp in upstate New York. And these guys would show up and we would do, a weekend of full yoga, as well as that would also include like a talent show, for example. And it was really amazing to see like how these personalities started to shine and people started to emerge out of, a cocoon that they were living in.
Aaron, thank you so much for all you've shared so far. Sivana family, we are going to continue this conversation with Aaron in Thursday's episode. You do not want to miss it, especially if you've been enjoying the story and all the gold nuggets of wisdom that Aaron has to share with us that you've learned so far. Make sure to tune into Thursday's episode where we continue this conversation. We'll talk about why simply listening to another person's breath can really change our lives. Aaron has so many more nuggets of wisdom to share. So tune in to Thursday's episode to hear the rest of Aaron's amazing journey. I'm wishing you a beautiful day. From my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to SivanaSpirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at Facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at SivanaEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode. And thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.
I think that being naked really was the great equalizer. It's something that puts us all on more of an even playing field. And, I even see it like when I talk to people and they go, oh, naked yoga, I could never do that. And I see them going within themselves going, who am I without my clothes?
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Welcome back to the show. We are picking up today our conversation with Yogi Aaron. We're talking all about nude yoga. And this practice of naked yoga is much, much deeper than you may think. It's something that I have been so interested in for so long. So I was so glad when Aaron agreed to come on the show. If you missed Tuesday's episode, definitely listen to it because it is a fascinating story. Aaron is the author of Autobiography of a Naked Yogi, and he shares with us this journey of how he pioneered the practice of naked yoga for men in the early 2000s in New York City, and how he developed and grew this practice from a small experimental class to a large studio offering over 15 nude yoga classes a week. We talk about stripping away clothing as a way to access the deepest layers of ourselves. Whether you think you might ever want to take your clothes off in yoga or not, this podcast is full of gems that are going to make you curious about getting out of your comfort zone, maybe exploring partner yoga, and who knows, maybe even taking your clothes off as well. Let's dive back into our conversation with Aaron. Walk me through a typical class. Like in the early days. So I know you mentioned people leave their clothing at the door and they come in, and you mentioned having studied with Brian Kess. So I'm imagining there was some sort of power flow or heating flow to get people sweaty as a first step. Is that correct? Was the room heated at all?
So for just a disclosure statement or disclaimer, the way I teach now is nothing the way I used to teach.
Yes, and we're going to hear about how you transitioned too, a little bit away from this practice. But talk about back then first.
So, yeah, I mean, I kind of went from Brian Kess to Ashtanga. So Brian Kess was my first teacher. David Swenson was my second teacher. And I'm trying to remember now, there's another teacher of mine. His name just escaped me, and that's horrible. But I would teach the first year and almost 2 years. So the class was always 2 hours. And so and it always actually, some nights it went into 3 hours. But the first half of the class, so about the first hour and 15 minutes would be like a power flow sequence. And I used to play a lot of music back then. So I used to choreograph like these great, sequences. And it was great because, the guys loved it. I mean, a lot of the guys that came were already doing like power flow kind of yoga classes or fitness style yoga classes. And then we would stop the class. So I would finish the sequence and usually about 1 hour and 15 minutes in. And I would stop and I would say, okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And this is a chance for you to go and meet 5 people you didn't know before. So I would encourage them to go around and would have people go around and talk. And then I would say, okay, find a partner. And so for the next hour and 15 minutes, I would continue on then with like doing partner yoga. So I would have a power quote unquote flow sequence, and then I would have a partner sequence. And then we would always end the classes in partner shavasana.
Ooh, well, okay. Well, I want to hear what that entails in just a minute. But before we talk about partner shavasana, though, did you find a difference in doing these power flow, vinyasa flow, ashtanga, whatever we want to call it, naked? Like I heard, I don't know, but I've heard that, when you're naked, all of a sudden, sometimes like poses that are inaccessible to you, or for example, things like binds or arm balances where often you're like slipping on your clothes or stuff isn't really working. All of a sudden you strip the clothes off and things are just working a lot better. You're getting into deeper holds. You're getting into those binds that you couldn't access before. Is that true?
I think that clothes get in the way. I really do. I mean, right from when I used to joke about, let's get naked in those early days with my mixed groups, with my co-ed groups, I would notice like how much clothes would get in the way. So how much of that is a reason to practice naked yoga? I don't know. But what I can tell you is, especially in those early days, there was such a sense or a feeling of empowerment. I mean, watching these guys, and you could literally feel people feeling empowered. And I don't think it necessarily came from just the nakedness. I think it came from everything. I think it came from the sense of, we're doing this together. We're in this together. We're enjoying this moment together. If that makes any sense to you. I don't know if I've articulated it well enough.
Yeah, no, I think if you want to do naked yoga, it shouldn't just be because you want to be able to, bind your side angle pose or something. It's like that could be a side effect, but this is about, stepping into your body in a new, authentic, empowering, healing way. So it was half a flow that you're familiar with, half partner yoga. And then what is partner shavasana? Because you can't throw a term out there like that and then not describe for us what that is.
Well, you haven't even asked me what partner baddha konasana is. Yet, but
oh my goodness.
That's another podcast. So, no, partner shavasana, there's a few ways to do partner shavasana. But one of them, the most simplest way is that you kind of lie head to toe and your inner arm would then sort of line up with your partner's inner arm. And so you're connected throughout the whole shavasana, if you can imagine that.
Sounds so lovely and intimate, really intimate.
Yes, intimate. I mean, we broke all the boundaries of intimacy.
And I think it's interesting because you talked a little bit earlier about this difference between sensuality and sexuality, but in all this partner work, did for the most part it stay in this zone of sensuality, or did things ever get sexual?
No, I mean, I'm very good at holding space. So when I say something is a certain way, people tend to listen in my yoga classes. And one of the things that we were very clear on is that, and we would always let people know before they came to a class, that there would be a lot of sensual touch. And sensual touch is basically just touch. I mean, it's me putting my hand on your heart, or putting my hand on your shoulders, or our palms coming together to make partner namaste mudra. So there's all kinds of, we encourage touch. Touch was a huge part of it, but where the line was sexual touch. So sexual touch was never allowed. So obviously then sexual touch would be anytime where we're putting our hands on our partner's genitals, or in an inappropriate place. Or if your partner didn't want to be touched, that would also be inappropriate as well. The space that we held for people to be in was very clear. And I always, and my teachers always gave very clear instructions on where to put your hands and where not to put, not really so much not where to put your hands, but we always gave people very clear instructions on what to do. So they weren't like left wondering, okay, what do I do next? And what I also noticed is that people were very respectful to each other. And I never really saw anybody being disrespectful. What I did find, which was interesting, is that a lot of people sadly don't know how to touch each other. You would say something like, put your hands on your partner's shoulders and then feel a sense of energy building around the shoulders and neck, and then kind of very slowly drag that energy down your partner's arms to their hand. And you would see sometimes with some people who are not so familiar with touch, some very different interpretations that were not very probably pleasant for the person receiving that. And so what I found was that my role started to become like this educator, like, how do we touch each other? What is sensual touch? What is healing touch? What is loving touch? And so these were things that I began to explore over the next 10, 12 years.
Were people having emotional releases in the class? Were there tears, emotions coming up?
A lot, especially, as I said, I started teaching in 2001. So my very first class was March 18th, 2001. And of course, that 9/11 happened shortly after that. And for really the next couple of years after that, there was a lot of emotions that were brought up, depending on the kind of class that I would teach and depending on what I was doing. But especially in those earlier days, there was a lot of breakthroughs for a lot of people. Because a lot of us have this idea that to be naked is to be sexual, and nothing more could be perverted. We are born naked, we die naked. That's just a fact. And, and somewhere along the way, we've become associated with this idea of, okay, we only get naked if we're having sex. And, we forget, like, being naked is a natural state, and it's a beautiful place to meet someone, on and it can be very soulful.
I love that. What was the sort of instruction you gave to folks if their partner started crying or started having an emotion come out? How did you hold space, again, for so many people and so many partners? Were they supposed to comfort the person or just sit and wait? Like, what did you tell people to do?
I would say that the emotional releases, either one of two things happen. One is that if there was an emotional release when people were partnering, oftentimes they didn't know about it until either towards the end of a release or at the end of class. And because the person would tell me, or they would write me an email. And what I found is, like, a lot of times when that happened, the partner that was with them would be very comforting and nurturing. My therapist used to always say, like, the deepest thing that we all desire is to be seen. And I feel like when people need to be seen, that other people kind of show up for them. And that's what I noticed time and time again. Another thing that would happen is people would have a release, and it would usually be during Shavasana, or a moment when we were, back and by ourselves. And I always had assistants. So a lot of times the assistants would be going around the room and checking on people, or just being there for people if they needed, that space to be held.
So you just mentioned assistants, and I've heard over the course of our interview, you've talked about how this has grown. It grew. So were you training teachers? Were you writing books? How did this evolve? And then I know it evolved to a point where you sort of began to shift direction. So can you talk to us about that now?
Oh, Lord. It's like, you just asked like 8 years worth of questions.
Give me 3 sentences. No, it's okay. Did you train other teachers?
Yeah, I started my own teacher training. It was obviously very specialized, and the goal was to teach people cover my yoga classes. So that's really why I did that. I found it really difficult to bring in outside teachers. I found that the best teachers we had, and we had a lot of teachers, and I did eventually have to start having outside teachers join us. But I found always the best teachers were the teachers that were part of the community and people who had studied with me, and they knew sort of what I wanted because they had been there themselves. And so they had that experience. That's not to say I wasn't trying to teach and never wanted to teach clones. I just wanted to teach people how to do good sequencing and then how to lead the classes in a good, wholesome way. And I started to grow. I mean, I had a studio. I found a studio space in 2004 that became my studio space. And that was when I really started to have a lot of classes. And then when I lost that space, I moved, ironically, to 23rd Street and 6th Avenue again, where I came up with the original idea. And I actually got a studio, like a real like above ground yoga space. Because up until that point, Hot Nude Yoga was really underground. And at that moment, we started to move above ground.
And at that point, at the peak, was it like there's several classes a day?
We went up to 15 classes a week. I think that's where we maxed out at one point.
All nude.
All naked.
And all for men.
Yes.
And just so people listening, I mean, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are all women, all female nude classes, right?
I don't know. I honestly don't know what's happening out in the world of naked yoga anymore.
So I think there are, because the friend that I had talked to, he mentioned that where he worked in the United Kingdom, there were men's classes, women's classes, and co-ed classes. So if you're a woman listening to this, I mean, I do think you can find this with a girl tribe, basically. I'm sure that exists.
Or start your own.
So the studio's doing well and it's at its peak. What then shifted? Because obviously you're no longer in New York, you're now in Costa Rica. So I'm guessing some big shifts happened.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of things that shifted for me. As much as I loved, and I still miss it, I miss my community. Once in a while I go to New York and I have a couple of friends that lead or have still kind of run the group, so to speak. It's under a new name, a different name. But they asked me to teach, and I go and teach, a class, and I do something for them. And I go back there, and I just miss it so much. I miss the community. There's the community aspect, hands down. It's just so warm and so nurturing. I miss that a lot. I miss my male tribe. But I started to shift, and there's a lot of things that shifted for me. One is I was tired of New York. I knew that I love my time in New York. I would never say anything bad about New York, never. But, and I just felt like, I knew this wasn't the place I was going to be for, the rest of my life. And I was really craving to create like a community, like a retreat center or an ashram. And so my journey kind of brought me to Costa Rica, and that is what led me to opening up Blue Osa Yoga Retreat and Spa. I wanted to create a space that was yogic centric and that I could really, hold space for other people to experience yoga. And my business partner and I really thought about the idea of, doing more naked yoga and having naked yoga groups there and then, just having other gay groups come. And what we realized very quickly in the early days was that wasn't a good idea for a lot of reasons. And the idea started to morph into what Blue Osa is today. Very quickly it morphed into what we're doing today. I kind of felt like, I think the greatest thing a person can do in their life is create something and then walk away from it. Create something to the point where it's so successful and then just go do something else. And that's what I did with Hot Nude Yoga. The big year, 2009 and even 2010 were, two huge years of success and sort of the culmination of everything that I had worked towards. And I left it knowing I did the best job I possibly could. And it gave me such pleasure and such delight to see, maybe not hundreds, but a lot of people around the world starting to pick up that mantle and starting, to do their own things.
So big question. Do you right now, as your personal practice close on or close off?
It depends, but it can be a little bit of both sometimes. It depends on where I am. Having a yoga retreat center does not afford one a lot of the luxury of privacy.
Well, it's just so interesting because I feel like having got to talk to you and got to know you better, it's not so much just like it's fun to practice asana with your clothes off. So, I mean, in the privacy of your room, it's like really about this sense of community, like what you kept telling us about. So that's the biggest piece. That's the reason why you'd strip down.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what other people would say or type in, but in my book, Autobiography of a Naked Yogi, I talk a lot about what came out of this experience was community. I mean, anybody that you talk to that was my student during, or part of my group during those years will tell you for them it was about the community. It's the first word that will generally come out of their mouth is the sense of community. And I think that being naked really was the great equalizer. It's something that puts us all on more of an even playing field. And, I even see it like when I talk to people and they go, oh, naked yoga, I could never do that. And I see them going within themselves going, who am I without my clothes? And yeah, the community aspect of it, hands down, was really the driver for it.
Aaron, before we let you go, you just mentioned your book, and I was about to ask you about it. Autobiography of a Naked Yogi. Listeners, if you're interested and want to get more information on that, I'm assuming, like the title states, it's talking a lot about going deeper into some of the things we've touched on in this episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely I talked a lot about hot nude yoga and what happened there. And then how that led me to the Himalayas, which led me to facing one of the most challenging things of my life, which then led me to Costa Rica. And I wrote it in a very kind of cool way. It's got a very chicken soup for the soul kind of feel to it, so that I broke up all the points along my life in like small bite-sized chapters. So you don't have to feel like you have to read the whole book quickly. You can just like read a little bit every night.
That's lovely. And the other kind of big last question I wanted to ask you was just because so many of our Sivana listeners, they do have a deep spiritual practice and they're interested in, going into the deepest layers of who they are. And I'm just wondering if you think taking off your clothes has a real value for folks, regardless if they're male or female, regardless of whether they want to do it in their home or in a community. Like, how can this be something that people or listeners play with or integrate some of these ideas we've like danced on, into their daily life right now?
Well, I'm the first place. I mean, oh God, I'm sorry. I just had like 5 answers pop out of my mouth. The first thing to understand is yoga practice is synonymous with the word called experimentation. And this doesn't get taught enough. Like, to practice is to experiment. And I would encourage people to create experiments that push them outside any box that they live in. And so if you think that being naked is uncomfortable, then strip down your clothes right now. Don't even wait.
Do it right now.
Do it right now. The second thing I would suggest is to get a partner yoga book. Look for one that is inspiring, one that's not so challenging. Some of these partner yoga books are a little crazy, but find one that's, has something worthwhile to say, easily applicable in your life, and do what I did and grab a friend, and commit to just breathing. Because sometimes when people do partner yoga, they become chatty Cathys. And, part of the tapas of a yoga experience is just be quiet and listen to breaths. And it's so potent. Oh my God. When you start listening to another person's breath, everything changes. Your life will never be the same after that. It's amazing what happens when you can start to really sink into a posture with another person. And then do that. And then maybe do it again. Do exactly the same poses, but do it naked with that person the next time. And see how it feels and see what comes up and watch your inner reaction. It's such a potent thing to do. I remember one of my students quoted me one time in a documentary video, and he said, that I said, it's about you watching yourself, watch yourself. Become the witness of yourself, and so just tune out everything, listen to breath and go back to watching yourself. Tune into breath, watch yourself and watch what comes up and it's fascinating. And I think that if people do that, they will start to have a very deep and profound experience.
I love that advice. And it's so different. Do you agree, Aaron? Because I know I've gone to some acro yoga classes, and it has that really cool sense of community that you talked about, but it's very almost like analytical, like in your head, because it's like you're trying to figure out how to do all these complex moves. And then, I don't know, there's a little bit of self-consciousness, I think, that creeps in because, again, you're trying to do these complex, often, challenging postures. So if you're new, and I love this idea of what you're saying is just sit with a partner and breathe. It doesn't have to be acrobatics.
I mean, one of my favorite postures, which was interesting because I used to do this all the time as a chakra practice, is sitting naked, and you can do it clothed as well, with your partner and back to back. So you're actually not even looking at each other. You're just sitting so that your spine is with your partner's spine. And my teacher, Alan Finger, one day did this in his class. And I was like, I've been already doing this. And this is a sacred tantric practice. that he's doing. And he had everybody sitting back to back, and then had everybody meditating on their partner's chakras. I mean, talk about going deep. And just sitting back to back doing that. That's a simple partner practice.
I love that. That is so beautiful. And I love Alan too. I studied with him as well. So we have a teacher in common. That's very cool. Aaron, it's been so fun to connect with you. How can the listeners stay in touch? Obviously, they can get your book, Autobiography of a Naked Yogi, and they can come and actually be with you. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about your retreat center in Costa Rica, Blue Osa?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. The best way to connect with me is through yogiaaron.com. And that's just Yogi Aaron, YOGIAARON.com. And on there, I have a blog. I have a very dynamic blog, so people can, sign up for that if they want to. And today, actually, I just opened an article called The 10 Signs that You Have Reached Enlightenment. Ironically, one of them is not getting naked, so don't worry. But I offer yoga teacher training, 1-month immersions. Earlier, I was talking about people through an experience. So one of my greatest passions is leading yoga teacher trainings here at Blue Osa. And we have 2 offerings. We have one that's 1 month and then one that's 14 days. And the 1-month immersions are really transforming. If you have any question about who you are, your place in the world, what path you're supposed to be on, this is the program that answers a lot of those questions and gets you back on track in your life and helping you to release those things that aren't working for you. That's what gets me excited is sharing that with people and then also having them go through that experience. And then, of course, we talked about my book, Autobiography of a Naked Yogi. It's a great read. Even I enjoy reading it. So it's a great read.
That says a lot, especially if you spent so much time, I'm sure, writing and editing it. So I'm going to put all those links for the listeners down below. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Costa Rica. Sivana family, let me know what you thought of this week's episode. Did you learn something new? Do you feel differently about the idea of stripping off your clothes and practicing naked, whether at home or in a group? I would love to hear from you. Remember, you can post post your comments, questions, and ideas at savannahspirit.com/group. That's going to redirect you to our private Facebook group where I can approve you as a member. And remember that the number one way to support the show here is by leaving a rating or review here on iTunes. And if you're not sure how to do that, because I know it's complicated, you can go to savannahspirit.com/review for a quick step-by-step tutorial on how you can leave a review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a beautiful day and maybe even take your clothes off. So much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/SivanaSpirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at SivanaEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode. And thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.